Yeah. Well, it's very good to see all of you this evening. Thankful to have so many of you to come out and be a part of this study together. Pray that you've had a successful week so far, and that as we come together and go through our time of study together, that we can be further encouraged to finish out our week strong and prepare ourselves for our next assembly on the upcoming Lord's Day. Tonight we're moving on into Genesis chapter 9, and I don't believe I told Brother Gilbert the title as to what I was thinking about in going through the study, but in going through Genesis chapter 9 and I'm looking at the information, I see a new beginning, but with a new beginning we still have the same problems. And I was listening to some information earlier from a recent lectureship online, and a brother described it this way, and I think it's rather fitting considering our time frame and dealing with technology and things of that nature. He said, in view of the things that happened from Genesis chapter 6 up to Genesis chapter 9, with the flood, the judgment of the world, Noah and his family coming off the ark, it's almost like a system reboot took place. And if you've dealt with computers and you've run into slow problems on your system, I guess, well, Brother Joe's grinning, he can tell us all about that. You run into a problem with your system, and what do you have to do? I mean, old days of Nintendo, turn it off and turn it on again. It's kind of what we have going on. Everything has reached to a crescendo, if you will, to where everything just needs to reset. But with the reset, we still are going to run into the same problems. Now, the reason for that is because we have not come to the point where the promise, the purpose in which God has established with Eve, and that he's going to establish here with Noah and his seed line, and then later with Abraham, has not come to fulfillment. We've not received that promise. The seed line has not been completed so as to bring the Messiah to where sin is able to be ultimately cured, as it will be when Christ comes to be crucified on the cross for our sins. So when we're considering Genesis chapter 8 with the flood ending, we need to make sure that we continue to establish in our minds that these principles that we're going through are going to follow us through the rest of this book and even through the rest of the Old Testament. With the beginning section of the flood, you have a direct command given to Noah and his sons to build the ark. There's a direct command being given to Noah and his family to enter the ark. Now that we have the flood ending, Genesis chapter 8, Genesis chapter 9, what do we have with them coming off of the ark? A direct command. What are we trying to emphasize? God's commands need to be listened to. If you're wanting to get to the end conclusion where, okay, we've reached the point of salvation, we've been carried through, then you have got to follow and obey the commands as they're given to you. But also, when we're considering Genesis chapter 8, I failed to get to this point last week, and I do not want to leave it before we transfer over to what's going to happen in Genesis chapter 9, because it's going to be a crucial point when we consider some things that are going to transpire in this chapter that are rather sad, and to a degree, I guess we could even say disappointing, but we're going to try to not point the finger too hard at these individuals and these characters. So we have, with the flood, the amount of time, 150 days, in which Noah and his family spent on the ark waiting for the waters to come down, to recede. They're called out of the ark, and what's the first thing that we have recorded that Noah and his family did? What is it? They built an altar. Now, when we're thinking about them building an altar, you're going to offer up a sacrifice. When we're considering a sacrifice, now I've had some conversations with different ones outside the Lord's church and even some inside the Lord's church that have a misconception as to what all is included when individuals are offering up sacrifices. I've had some individuals just say, like for example, they said it's a bad illustration, it's a bad example to use Cain and Abel as improper modes of worship. Because they're looking at it from the standpoint of, well, a sacrifice just has to deal with the atonement of sin. You're coming before God offering up a blood sacrifice so as to have your sins removed. And what does that really have to do with worship? Well, what are they failing to connect? What are they failing to realize when an individual builds an altar and offers up a sacrifice? It is worship. Now, how can we prove that? All right, God commanded it, but we can find some verses where, in fact, individuals are saying that they're going to offer sacrifice, and at the same time, they say, we're going up to worship. All right, very good. Genesis chapter 22 with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham tells his two young men, you stay here, me and the lad, we're going up to worship God. What about in the New Testament? Peter has something to say about us as members of the Lord's church and what it is that we actually do today. We are brought together as lively stones, a royal priesthood, and what do? We're living sacrifices. All right, we're living sacrifices, and that's Paul in Romans. Peter says that we bring forth spiritual sacrifices when we come together to worship. So when we have Noah and his family and they're coming off of the ark, put yourself in that situation. The entire world has been judged for sin. And you and your family are the last ones on earth. What would be the first thing you did? All right, thanking God. That's what Noah and his family are doing. We went through a discussion last week about how God remembered them. What do they do when they come off the boat, come off the ark? They remember God. And certainly going through all of that, I mean, just that's a solemn time, is it not? Just think of the loss. I was racking my brain, and if I thought about it, I should have gone back to Facebook and looked at your information that you did about the supposed or estimated population that could have been on the earth at that time. Just think about the massive loss of life. And then you're the only ones left. That would be a solemn and a sobering moment to step off the ark onto dry ground. What better thing to do than worship God? First thing. There is nothing better to do. And so as we go through our lives, and we're going through the good days, as we do the bad days, do we think about taking time to remember God? Taking time to pray? Taking time to study? Singing, for that matter? Singing does a great deal to lift the soul. And I wish we were going to have some more time together, because as we go through the book of Genesis, I have some information that deals very heavily with the importance of singing, and for Christians to be involved in singing. So I wanted to make sure that we hit that point in moving forward in chapter 9, because it is going to be it's a high moment, is it not? I mean, here's a glorious moment with Noah and his family, and they're coming off the ark and they worship God. And it says, it goes before the Lord to smell it. The Lord smelled a sweet savor. The Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. While the earth remaineth, seed time, harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. What a triumphant moment. And to have a pledge from God saying, I'm not going to do this ever again at this point in Noah and his family's life. But what's going to happen in chapter 9? Sin. Now, brethren, that's important. That is crucial for us to realize. That even though Noah and his family have been transported from the old world being destroyed into this new world, sin has been judged. But has sin been removed? No, sin is still there. And that even though we have this triumphant moment, we can end up finding ourselves going right back down, up on the mountain, down in the valley. And as you go through Israel's history, that's what they're constantly doing. They're up and they're down, they're up and they're down. And that's how the Christian life is. If you were to draw it on the board, I've seen it illustrated this way, if you were to draw a straight line on the board, and that's the example of Christ. That's the life of Christ, and that's the line that he walked. How would our life be? Going up and down, intersecting that line. Certain points we're going to be closer to it, and then other times we're going to find ourselves further away. But what can we do? We can always find ourselves being able to go back to that point. So with chapter 9, as we move forward now, dealing with those commands. As we said, we have been shown to us the significance of faith and obedience all the way through. And that's going to be crucial because, as we said previously, Noah could not see much of what was happening. So faith is evidence faith is evidence of things which are not seen. Correct? So as he's going through these 150 days and the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, what's he having to do? We sing a song, trust and obey. Faith, obedience, walking along with God through this time frame. So as we said in chapter 9, we have a new beginning. But we're not back in Eden, even though we had this new beginning. Things have changed. And we have a commission that's going to be given to Noah that's actually similar to what was said to Adam with a few differences. So Genesis chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now that's similar, is it not? That's what we have being said to Adam and Eve when they were created. He said, you go forth and you multiply. All right? But notice this in verse 2. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. Now here we have a transition from what was going on previously. When Adam and Eve are created, what do you have being said to them? Every herb and seed-bringing plant, it's meat to you. Now we have this shift to where meat is being put on the diet. It's being put on the menu. Why the shift? I don't know, other than God has the ability and He has the right to implement and bring things in as He chooses. And we're going to see that exemplified again in this chapter as well. Verse 4, chapter 9, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. Now, why is that a crucial verse? And why have that implemented here? Go ahead, Chad. All right. Well, cannibalism for sure. You know, you're not eating human flesh, but what about just dealing with animal flesh? And that's also going to be in the application here. All right. The life which is the blood thereof, ye shall not eat it. Now, do we not have a similar command being given over in the New Testament? Anybody think where that happened? All right, Acts 15. There's a huge commotion going on in the first century in the Lord's church over the matter of circumcision. And you have Judaizers coming into the Lord's church amongst the Lord's people and saying, you still have to be circumcised so as to be saved. The apostles come together with certain ones of the elders and different disciples, followers of Christ, and they have a meeting about this issue, and they end up coming to the conclusion based upon the evidences of the Gentiles coming in, obeying the gospel without circumcision. And in that conclusion, what do they end up saying to the Gentile people? Well, you're not needing to be circumcised, but there are some certain elements that you're needing to refrain from. Fornication, things that are strangled, and then you have this in there as well. So here we are in Genesis chapter 9, a statement that's being made to Noah at this point, and what about when we get thousands of years on down into the future? I mean, even to the point where we are today. This is still binding. This is still a point to where people are needing to realize you do not eat this. Why? Because the life is in the blood. And what the blood was going to end up symbolizing and what it was going to end up taking on with the sacrifice of Christ. You set this apart. And it's an important thing to recognize because this is before the law of Moses as well. So this predates Moses on Mount Sinai and them receiving those laws. This has been something that has just been the case from the beginning. You just do not do this. And it's something that has not changed. So as we said, there's a little bit of difference between Genesis chapter 9, Noah and his commission, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, just to refresh our minds. God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. The difference between what is said to Adam and what's said to Noah is that with Adam it's being said to them, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. They were to have dominion. Whereas with Noah and his family, it's just being said they're just going to fear you. There's going to be dread. So there's a shift taking place with this dominion or this control that was going to be had with these individuals. Now, what's another point that we have being introduced at this point, or at this time? Okay, very good. Chapter 9 has the introduction to civil government. Capital punishment. If you slay a man, then your life is to be taken. Now, again, a significant point. We have a change taking place from what has previously happened. When Cain killed Abel, how did judgment go in that situation? All right, Cain was marked. By whom? Okay. When Cain killed Abel, the arrangement in that situation was a direct judgment being taken place by God. Now what do we have happening? Man's judgment. Now why is that important? Can God change the way that He operates as He chooses? I mean, you take, for example, with the creation. Does life come about the same way as it did when God created everything? No, He set into motion a process whereby the earth would then continue to reproduce. Now, when He first did it, He did it by His word. Special creation. But now, how does it take place? Well, seed falls to the ground and things grow, so on and so forth. Well, what do we have taking place here? God's not operating the same way. That's important for when we get into situations like under the New Testament system, where we have individuals today that still want to hold on to the Holy Spirit working as He did in the first century. We come along and we try to help them to see from studying the Scriptures. That was not destined to last forever. It had a point in which it was destined to stop. Now they look at us and say, well, that's sacrilegious. That's almost blasphemous. But we can take situations like this and show them very clearly. There are different points in time where God says, okay, I did it this way at one point. Now things are changing. I mean, for that matter, you have, for a time, Jesus, the Son of God, was on earth. But He's not on earth anymore. But just because He's not here on earth, does that mean that He's still not operating in certain capacities? The Hebrew writer says He's our high priest, and that He makes intercession. He's our mediator. So before, when He was here on earth, He had on a certain role and He did certain things, but now He's not on earth. That doesn't mean that He's still not operating. Yes?
Most of these denominations cannot differentiate even between the Old and the New Testament.
Right.
How it changed from that to now.
Well, and even here, from the patriarchal system to the time frame of the law of Moses, then to the time frame of the law of Christ, which we're under now, that you're seeing a constant shift. I mean, what's a pretty famous one when we consider Genesis chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah? What was the relationship? They're husband and wife. Different ones saying different things. All right, she's barren, but what's the physical relationship? They're husband and wife, half-sister. All right? Now, what happens when we get under the time frame of Moses? Can you marry your half-sister anymore? No, you can't. So you see, there's a shift. There's a change. Under the law of Moses, this is sinful. With Abraham, it's okay. Well, is God just arbitrarily saying, well, this is all right at different times? No. As we're going along, and we're moving further away from what God had originally created, you start marrying too close to your family members and you start having problems. So we have further consequences that go down the line as to what's happening from the time of the Garden of Eden and the transgression there. So as we said, God is personally and directly giving judgment. Now we have it moving over into the hands of men with giving out a punishment. It's a new design so as to protect mankind. Verse 6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. Now, why the new design? As we said previously, we want to keep in mind as to where we're going. Genesis chapter 10, Genesis chapter 11, what are we going to be introduced to? Or I should say, who are we going to be introduced to?
Abraham and promise.
Well, not yet. 10 and 11.
Yeah.
The sons.
Huh?
The sons you talking about?
Well, the sons, but then, all right, Tower of Babel. All right, everybody's going to scatter. And they're going to scatter in, and what are they going to create? Nations, kingdoms. So what do we have going on here? This is the establishment of politics. Civil government. How are we going to regulate? How are we going to protect one another? The reason is going to be announced with the development of those nations. So when we're going through these sections and we come across, well, you don't eat blood, for the life therein is the life thereof. Okay, why is that there? Well, because of what's coming. If you shed man's blood, by man shall your blood be shed. Why do we have that? Well, it's because of where we're going. It's because of what's coming about. You're going to have all these different people. They're going to scatter out. And what is going to happen to these people when they scatter out? They are going to become ruthless. The Philistines and some of the things that they were involved in and what they would do to their captives, I mean the Assyrians, the Babylonians, they would do some atrocious things as they would go out and plunder and maraud and just ravage the countrysides. So what do we need in place so as to try to stem that? You have these laws being put into place. So instead, now, I have this wording in here, and I noticed that as I was typing it out, that the wording is wrong, and I want to see if you can tell me why it's wrong. So the reason this is taking place is because the development of these nations, instead of divine correction, there will be human government. Now, what's wrong with that statement? Oh,
Still under divine.
okay. Government is still divine. The laws that Noah and his family are going to have, where did they come from? They came from God. It's divine. Moses on Mount Sinai, where did those laws come from? They came from God. That's divine. So we need to be, now certainly today, when we consider the majority of our laws, we do not have prophets or anybody else going up on top of a mountain and getting laws from God. I mean, the speed limit that we have out today, that's not divine. That's not from God. That's man. But a lot of the laws that we do have on our books come from the Bible originally. So when we consider a lot of the things that are governing our nation, when this nation was first started, a lot of them, most of them were God-fearing individuals. And they realized that a lot of the laws that were found during the time frame of the law of Moses, especially like the cleanliness, cleanly laws, the sanitation laws, personal hygiene laws, they realized those are just good things, just common sense things. Well, that's what you get when you have divine law being given. And so here again, what is this going to set us up for? You're going through the study of Romans with Brother Gilbert. What's coming up in chapter 13? Government. Where did that start? Genesis 9. Right where we are. And it doesn't leave. And that's a crucial point we're going to get into in just a moment. So this section also explains things like the Code of Hammurabi. Anybody familiar with that? Joe, a little bit. I'm sure Brother Gilbert is. The Code of Hammurabi is a law codex that was established by a king of Babylon. Now, a lot of individuals, a lot of skeptics and intellectuals who would like to try to discredit the Bible They would look at the code of Hammurabi and say, well, this actually came about and was established before Moses was given the law. And so a lot of people say that Moses just copied what Hammurabi put down because they are in fact so similar. But what's the answer to that?
Law before was verbal.
Okay, law before is verbal, and they're being told these things, and certainly if they wanted to write them down, they could. But when we consider, okay, Hammurabi, he was before Moses. I don't doubt that. I do not argue that. I agree with that. He was before Moses. But how is it that here is Hammurabi, who is a Babylonian king, and yet he has so many similar laws like the children of Israel do in Moses? All right, came from God. Well, where did Babylon come from? Okay. In Genesis chapter 10, I know we're in Genesis chapter 9, we're going to get Genesis chapter 10 just for a little bit, go through some of these names. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 6. The sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Phut and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah and Sapta and Ramah and Sapteca. And the sons of Ramah, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, which is going to become Babylon. The reason why he has those similar laws is because his family came off the ark. And just going back a few generations, he's connected to Noah. And they would have been given the same laws and the same instructions as Noah and his 3 sons. So there's no contradiction, there's no problem there. We can explain that very easily. And it helps us also to be able to piece together that in fact we have being able to prove that man was never without divine law from God. Now, granted, the law shifts when Moses comes in. But even when we consider the law that's being given to Moses, could a person be saved outside of the law of Moses under the Old Testament time frame? Yeah. I mean, you have, not Abimelech, who am I trying to think of? Nebuchadnezzar in the time frame of Daniel. Now, he has to be brought down low at one point, but when he ends up coming back to himself, he ends up making a grand confession that there is no other God aside from the God of Daniel. You have Jonah going to Nineveh, and it says the Ninevites repented. Well, repented of what? Repented how? They're not under the law, they're Gentiles. Oh, they're under law. What's that?
Patriarchal.
Okay, yeah, I would agree. Patriarchal, still going for the Gentiles. Still being able to offer sacrifices, just not through a Levitical priesthood. Able to implement a lot of the same things. And then you have other passages like Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, which says that it's not in man to direct his own steps. Now, if that verse is true, and it is, then that means that man has always had to be governed by something. Otherwise, he's just out here directing his own steps when that verse says they don't. We don't. And so they were not left alone then. They're not being left alone through this time frame moving through Old Testament history. What about today? Have we been left alone today to try to direct our own steps? No, we have not. Things might have changed, laws might have changed, but we still have commandments, ordinances, doctrines in which we're commanded to follow. And so as the people will be dispersed in chapter 11, they're going to take these laws with them. Laws that were passed from God down to Noah through his family. And so they would continue to be transferred along with those who would desire to continue to seek after God. I mean, for that matter, when we get to the time frame of Moses, before he's given the law, who does Moses run into in the land of Midian? Jethro. What is Jethro?
Priest.
He's a priest of the high God. And what about when Moses is given the law? What does Jethro do? What is it? Well, he helps them. Well, let me ask my question better. When Moses is given the law and they're taking off to the promised land, where does Jethro go? No, Jethro didn't go with them. He went home. He didn't go on with the Israelites. So what about him? He just continues on. And when we consider those that are coming out of the land of Midian, they are able to trace back their lineage back to Abraham as well. So all of this is being connected together. We're not needing to lose sight of where it is that we're going. So when we're considering Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, as we are here today with capital punishment, has capital punishment been abolished? No, it hasn't. Now, we have a lot of people today that would want to try to ignore it, see it as being cruel, see it as being outdated. Now, I understand that our judicial system is not at all what it should be. There are a lot of corrupt individuals that are in high places of power. But just because things get corrupted does not mean that they end up then losing their value. I mean, for that matter, how many congregations of the Lord's church end up being corrupted? Does that mean the Lord's church is now of no value? No. The Lord's church still has value as long as it strives to be pure. So with capital punishment, as long as it's able to be practiced justly and rightfully, then it doesn't need to be ignored. It needs to be practiced. It needs to be implemented. There has to be consequences to wrong that's done. Otherwise, law without punishment, that's no law. We can have a law on the books that says do not run red lights, but if you run a red light and nothing happens, what's the point in the law? We have a big divide going on in our country about law and order. I am all for law and order. Because what does it do? What is God trying to do right here for His people with capital punishment? He's trying to protect them. It keeps the peace. And some will look at it and say, well, these type of elements, they really don't work, so on and so forth. Listen, when you start taking individuals that just will not change and start continuously rotating them through the system like we are today, and we see it happening, people that do some heinous things, and then they go to jail, they get back out, they do it again, go to jail, get back out, do it again. Eventually, you need to say enough is enough. Now, as we said, it's a sad thing for a person to lose a life. But a person who's not going to change and not going to reform, and it's just going to be a menace to society, God is saying that person does not need to be here. And some will look at it and say, well, that's not very loving. Well, it's loving to me because that has me in mind. And it has all of us in mind over that individual. You're going to add something?
Justice.
Justice is important.
God has justice as well as mercy.
And how many times do we actually end up seeing God implement mercy over justice at points? Well, I say over justice, but equally with justice. There's still punishment. There's consequences that end up coming from these different things. So I'm going to jump ahead here. Didn't realize time was getting away from me so quickly. All right. Let's notice something very quickly with the rainbow. Now, the rainbow as being a token. I'm going to admit that there were some things within this section that I just really did not take the time to recognize. And as I said, it's just because I would go through and read it, because I was comfortable with it. I know what's in here. But when we consider the token and the rainbow is a solemn reminder that the world belongs to God. It's a universal token. We see the rainbow here in the United States. They see a rainbow over in Europe, on the other side of the globe. It's a universal sign as to the promise that God has made. And the rainbow ends up being related to nature, intended to be a solemn reminder that God is in control. And the fact that you have God saying that, and the bow shall be in the cloud. Now that's significance because it was the cloud. It's clouds that bring rain. So the very vehicle that brought about destruction before, now what's it bringing? It's bringing the sign that you do not need to be afraid of what transpired before. But also consider this. When we see the rainbow, what else is happening? And we need to remember this. As I said, I didn't notice it until picking up different material, listening to different ones. Notice verse 16 of chapter 9. And the bow shall be in the cloud. And what's that next phrase say? And I will look upon it. When we look at the rainbow, who else is looking at the rainbow? God is looking at the rainbow. And what does he say about it? That I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Now, as we said before, when God remembers, is it the same way like we remember? Is God up in heaven and he sees that rainbow and he's like, the covenant, almost forgot. No, it's showing forth God's action, his involvement in what's going on this earth and on this planet. When we are looking on it, he's looking on it, proving that God's activity, that still continues today. Those are the type of things that we can look at and be able to view and be able to say, God is still involved. And we struggle with that, do we not? We have many today who would say, if I could just see a miracle, if God could just reach down from heaven, touch me or talk to me and just give me some type of sign that he's there and that he's involved. Well, what about the rainbow? A universal token that when we look at it and we see it, God sees it too. And that reminds us that he's there. He's involved and he's keeping his promise, just as he said. So before the next bell hits us, any thoughts or comments or questions? I do have some thoughts about a usually big question that comes up from this section, and we'll try to hit that next week very briefly before going into chapter 10. Yes, sir.
There was some information that I had seen that I hadn't thought about, but when this vapor film covered the earth before the flood, it took that coming in, all that vapor disappeared, with the sun hitting the water particles in the air and caused the rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
So they never knew what a rainbow was before that time.
Okay, that's interesting. I'd not considered that. That this would be, if you do not have rain falling to where there's particles up in the air, water droplets in the air, you wouldn't have that bow before.
This was the first occurrence.
So this would have been one of the first occurrences. That's very good. I appreciate that. I'll make a note of that. Thank you. And so again, here we are. What is it?
What time frame are we looking at? From the beginning of the flood and then the flood to Moses? How many years?
Do I have that written down here? Well, from the flood to Moses, Moses is going to end up living he's going to be 950 years old when he dies. Then what did I say? Did I say Moses? Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, Noah, who built the ark? Moses? Noah is going to end up living to be 950 years old. So by the time frame we end up getting down to Moses, it's going to be within the couple thousand years again before we start hitting that. So there's a big gap in time that's going to end up transpiring.
And how many before the flood?
Roughly, it's going to be approximately about another 2,000 years. So you're looking about 2,000 years to about 2,000 years. So, okay. Well, he's already hit me with the other bell, and thank you. The questions are starting to get a little tough. You saved me.